Welcome to KDO Studios Short Row Smorgasbord. This is actually an excerpt from a larger class. I want to talk about different short row methods and why you would use them. But let's talk about what a short row is. A short row is literally exactly what it sounds like. You're knitting along and then you just stop short. So in this example, I've done 3 different types of short rows. You're knitting along in purple, and then I switched to yellow so you could see it. And so you knit the yellow and you knit part way across and then you stop. And you turn and you work back in the yellow. And then on the tops of all of these, I've switched to the blue yarn so you can see what you knit above that. A couple of turns that you need to know. When you knit to this point where you've got the last yellow stitch, we call this the turning point. I've actually got out a Sharpie and did what I called the turning yarn and made it navy blue with the Sharpie. That's just about 1 stitch's worth of yarn at the end of this yellow row. Then the stitch mount you've probably heard of, but it's the direction the stitch is on the needle. Regular stitch mount, the right side of the yarn, which is going to the stitch to its right, is on the front of the needle. So those are some important terms that you would need to know. Now, why would you want to work short rows? If you are a sewer, you can use a short row where you would have made a dart in your sewing. But when we're sewing, we start with fabric, and so there are places we want less of it, and so we do a dart and we cut some fabric out. But it's the opposite in knitting. We are creating the fabric. So instead of getting rid of the fabric at the dart, we just create fabric without creating fabric in what would have been the dart. One common place to do this is for sock heels, but there are all kinds of times you can do it. Let's look at an application for short rows. This is actually the body of a little stuffed animal. It was cast on this edge and worked in this direction. Anywhere it wanted to get wider, that's easy. You know how to do that. You increase stitches, and if you want it to become more narrow, you decrease stitches. Short rows provide the same function, but working in the other direction. Here, and there are about 2 rows in each of the armholes, just so you know, the edge that's the neck edge needs to be shorter than the edge that connects to the legs and at the bottom of the tummy. So there are short rows worked along here, which essentially creates little darts so that at the neck edge the body is much smaller. And then in the middle you may see that it's puffing up a little bit here, and that's not just because stockinette curls, but in addition to the short rows here, there are a couple short rows down on this side too, which really makes the tummy of the stuffed animal stick out. So here is the bear made up. This is part of a different short row class. You can see he has a nice fat tummy. You may be able to see there's a curve to his arms and paws. His little toes are pointed, and like I mentioned, nice fat tummy, and he can actually sit up. So in case you're wondering why you might want to work short rows besides socks, that's another idea, or they can also just be decorative. So now that you know what a short row is and why you might want to use a short row, then what could possibly be the problem? Well, just as when you work an increase, if you did it, let's say, as a yarn over, or maybe just a messy one, you could create a hole in your work somewhere right here if you added an extra stitch. And so there are all kinds of different ways of increasing it. You have the same potential problem here, because if you look, you work these 2 yellow rows, this blue stitch is actually attached to this one, and this purple stitch is attached to that one, which means you have 2 extra rows right here, and you could easily come up with a big hole right there. So just as with increases, basically what you were trying to do is minimize the hole, which for short rows, to be fair, is even worse because by definition we have to add 2 rows at a time. Just as people have their favorite types of increases, people have their favorite types of short rows. Most short rows use some combination of slipping, wrapping, and lifting to hide the hole that occurs right here at the turning point, the natural hole. So let's look at some of those different methods. As a point of reference, I worked the most basic short row turns, just turning the work and then also turning the work and slipping. Looking at what I have done here, where I just worked without slipping or anything, I've got a pretty big hole here, and you can see there are a couple of wonky looking stitches. The same thing worked from the purl side, pretty big hole here and a couple of wonky looking stitches. On the other side, we're definitely getting neater. You can see I have the one slip stitch here that feeds both pink stitches. I do still have a little bit of a hole here, but it's better. And same thing from the knit side. You can see where the slip happened, and it is definitely a little bit neater, but there is still a little bit of a hole here. To keep this, to be able to look at different methods, I'm now going to just knit 2 rows so that you can tell where we're starting the next section. Knitting 2 rows gave a little garter bump here so we can see the difference between the sections. I also want you to notice we can see where the stitches go diagonally because we made a triangle this way when we turned on knit rows, and we made a triangle that filled it back in when we worked on purl rows, but you can see the striping effect going sideways with the yarn. So now to give a little space so we can see our next sets of short rows, I'm going to purl a row, knit a row, purl a row. So first of the more advanced methods, we're going to look at probably the most common way of closing up your short row holes, your short row methods, and that is the wrap and turn. So I'm going to work 3 of them so that we can look at various ways of closing them. I am going to knit 9 to get to my turning point. When we work the wrap and turn, we're basically going to be slipping this stitch, this last pink stitch, without working it, but we're going to wrap a little collar around it with our turning yarn. It is possible to bring the yarn to the front first to wrap, or to leave it in the back when you wrap. The difference is that if you leave it in the back and slip first, you will get a properly oriented stitch if you pick up your collar, which we will talk about in a minute. If you bring it to the front first, you're going to get reversed mounted. And there are proponents of both methods. It's a little bit like if you're doing a make one and you pick this stitch up right here, many people will put a twist into the stitch to hide that increase. And I do as well. However, with the wrap and turns, I find that this is already a tight enough method. And if I choose to add that extra bit of twist by reverse mounting, that mine tends to pucker a little bit. So I'm going to work it without twisting, but if you find yours are too loose, then you may go ahead and twist. But enough of philosophy, let's work a wrap and turn. For my wrap and turn, as I mentioned, I am going to slip first. I'm going to bring my yarn to the front. I am going to slip it back, and then I'm going to bring my yarn to the back. That is my wrap, and that is my turn. And now we're going to purl 9 stitches back. I want 2 more wraps to show you various alternatives once you have made the wraps. So I'm going to knit 6, wrap and turn, purl back, and then I'm going to knit 3, wrap and turn, and purl back. If we look at what I've done here, you can see where I came across and I worked 9 stitches, and then I worked this little turquoise wrap and turn around the pink stitch. I didn't work the pink stitch. And then I worked across here in pink yarn, and I wrapped the yellow stitch without working it. And then the same thing, we've got 1 more wrap here. So let's talk about what we do with those wraps, because the wraps themselves, I don't think are that difficult, but for some reason, unwrapping seems to give people fits. Working across this row, I've got 3 regular knits. And then I get to my first wrap and turn collar, the green collar around the turquoise stitch, and this one I'm just going to knit. When we worked our first wrap and turn, that was a wrap only, but now I want to lift or unwrap my second wrap and turn. Many directions will tell you to reach in, lift the wrap, put it up on the needle, knit 2 together, and it will go to the back. And if you only have one color working, maybe that works reasonably well, but I can see my pink collar very well. We didn't really get that wrap to the back. So I'm going to back this up. Another person suggests that you do this, you lift it like this, but then you knit through the back loop. And that does get the wrap to the back, but it twists this yellow stitch, and I don't particularly want to twist this yellow stitch, so I'm going to back that up again. And I'm going to put my pink wrap back down around so you can see it. So I've just undone those 2 examples. Another possibility is to slip the yellow stitch, put the pink stitch up on the needle. The pink collar now becomes a stitch, and because of how I wrapped it, it is properly oriented. This yarn going to the right is in front of my stitch. I'm going to slip these 2 stitches back, and I'm going to knit 2 together. Certainly that worked well because my pink stitch is now behind, but I find that a little fiddly. I'm going to work 1 more. So when I get to my next wrap and turn, and I wish I could remember who showed me this, but this is a hack of a wrap and turn. This is going to be another lifted. I want to lift this stitch, but for now, all I'm going to do is reach under my wrap or my collar. I'm not going to lift it yet, or I'm not going to lift it all the way to the needle yet anyway. I'm going to, with it just parked there, I'm going to knit that stitch, and then I'm going to pull this stitch up and over just like a bind off. And I think that is an easy and fast way to complete your wrap. So my first wrap was wrapped but not lifted, and then my second 2 were both wrapped and lifted. And I am going to finish this row and then purl a row and knit a row to get ready to show you the same thing on the wrong side. Here I am on the wrong side, and I'm going to start by purling 9. On the wrong side, if I want to create a collar that is properly mounted when I lift it, the directions change. I'm going to bring the yarn to the back first, then I'm going to slip, then I'm going to bring my yarn forward, and then I'm going to slip it back, completing the wrap, and then I turn. And once I've turned, I'm going to knit 9 stitches. Once I have knit my 9 stitches and turned, I'm going to work 2 more wrap and turns. So I'm going to purl 6 and then wrap and turn and knit back. And then I'm going to purl 3 and wrap and turn and knit back. Looking at what I've done, I wrapped a little bit tightly here, but we have a collar, a little green collar around our turquoise stitch. We have a little yellow collar around another turquoise stitch. And then we have the turquoise collar around the yellow stitch. So now I'm ready to work back and look at how I work these wraps. I am going to purl 3. And then, for lack of a better word, I am going to work my first wrap and turn. I'm going to lift this wrap or unwrap this purl wrap, the quote-unquote official way to do it. It's not easy. Because everything's oriented differently, I'm going to slip the unworked stitch with the collar, then I'm going to lift the collar, but I'm still going to need to work on these a little bit. I'm going to slip them back, and I need to reorient everything. So first I want to show you. So if I pull this apart a little more, you can see that this collar is oriented properly as a stitch because of the way we wrapped it. But now I'm going to have to do something that's about like kissing your elbow. I'm going to do a slip, slip, purl. So I'm going to slip a stitch, which is of course was my collar. I slipped it knitwise to change the orientation. I'm going to slip that stitch, which was the unworked stitch, knitwise. I have to bring them both back to the left-hand needle. Then with my yarn in front, I come around the back and I have to come backwards through those 2 stitches and purl them. So that's a slip, slip, purl. let's get to the next wrap. So that's one way of lifting. For my second wrap that I want to lift with my yarn in front, coming up underneath, I want to pull my needle through the collar. Then I want to purl that blue stitch, and then I want to lift the yellow stitch over like a bind off. So it's not as easy as the knit, but I like it better than all that slip purling. Then I'm going to just finish the row purlwise, not lifting the third wrap, and then I'm going to knit and purl a row. Let's take a look at what we have here now. Where we wrapped and just worked across without lifting, you can see that we do have a little bump that shows where that collar is unworked. Now it shows up more when the color contrasts. Lucked out a little bit here and it doesn't show as much. If you were working garter stitch, this probably wouldn't matter, but if you wanted a smooth appearance, I don't think you would want to leave your wrap unworked. Now, looking here, the first one we worked the standard way. The pink collar is peeking out just a bit, but I think you can see this is very neat. And if you look over a couple more stitches, the hack looks very neat as well. Up here is my hack. And if you're looking carefully, actually the hack does leave part of the collar in front. Now it goes between two stitches, two knit stitches, and it's oriented in the same direction, so it will be less noticeable in the same color, but it is there nonetheless. And when we work the slip purl, you can see everything is very tidy and we're not seeing any of the collar. On the wrong side, we have our collars here, and you can see how those are disappearing pretty well into purl bumps. You don't really see them that much. They would disappear in garter stitch. On the lower part, from working from the knit side, this was our hack, and you can see a little bit of the collar. You're going to see that in almost every lifted method. And coming across, the traditional one has an advantage because it had the same color working right there, but there is its turning yarn or collar as well. So you can see that a little bit, but you can see if they're the same color, they would disappear. On the top, this is where we worked the standard one, and that's pretty neat. You can see really disappearing. The hack is pulling up a little bit, so maybe not quite as good as I originally thought. And again, we've got a little bit of a bump there, but not at all bad. You can see that the wraps can be a little fiddly, and so people started looking for other ways to lift that yarn up to close the gap, because it is doing a very nice job of closing the gap. So I'm going to knit the front, knit the back to make the garter bump, and then knit and purl to get ready for our next types of short rows. I'm going to look at 4 other lifting short row methods: the yarn over, the Japanese, the Sunday, and the twin. Because they have such similar appearance, I'm going to work them in the same section so we can compare them side by side. So first I'm going to knit 3, then I'm going to turn, then I am going to work a yarn over on my needle, and I am going to purl back. Working back across, I knit. There's my turning point. Here's my yarn over. You can see with the way I wrapped, it is oriented properly, and all I have to do is knit 2 together. I'm going to knit 1 more stitch, and then I'm going to work a Japanese short row. In order to do that, I turn my work, I slip 1 stitch purlwise, and then I put a stitch marker onto my yarn right here. That's where the collar would have been, that yarn, and I'm just going to hold it in place, and then I'm going to purl back across. When I work back across, I want to knit to the gap, and then all I need to do is take the pin, pull it up. I do want my stitch oriented properly, So I pop that onto my needle and I work this as I knit two together. I'm going to work one more stitch, and now I'm going to work a Sunday short row named for the creator or the inventor. Turn your work. This time I don't slip and I do pin, but I still pin. So another pinning method, and then I purl back across. So to complete the Sunday short row, I work across. I am once again going to pull this stitch marker to put a loop up on the needle. But before I do that, I want to tell you a couple of things. One, you could be using scrap yarn, particularly if you were doing a sock heel. You could just have a whole row of these on one thing of sock yarn. You could also thread a bunch of stitch markers onto your working yarn, as you might do with beads, to be able to slide them on very carefully. But I also want to mention quickly one other type of short row method. If this were to drop out, this looks exactly as it would if you had just turned your work without pinning or doing wrapping or anything else. And so there is a method called digging, where you come in and here's the stitch on the needle, here's the stitch below, and you literally dig in and pull this up. So it involves the least amount of mechanics, but you have to really trust that you can dig this out. So we are not going to do that. So I'm going to put my pin back in. I'm going to turn around. I am going to pull on the stitch marker. I'm going to pop it up on my needle, and you guessed it, knit two together. Now I'm going to knit one more stitch. The last method is very intriguing. It does involve lifting it up onto the needle, but it creates a shadow or twin stitch. On the knit side, it is worked just like making a right lifted increase. I want to work into the stitch below the stitch on my left-hand needle. There are various ways of doing this. You can pick up the stitch below and put it on the needle and knit it. You can actually just go in the back and grab it like that and knit it. This yarn is a little bit splitty though, so I think I'm going to go back to the front. I'm going to pick this stitch up. I'm going to knit into this stitch, and that's a right lifted increase. That's one of my favorite increases, but for now I'm going to put this stitch back onto the left-hand needle, and you can see we've created twins. So I'm going to turn my work and purl back across. Then I'm going to turn and I'm going to knit back across to my twin stitch. And there it is. You can see they're both in the same stitch. And so you guessed it, knit two together and knit to the end of the row. And now I'm going to purl a row and knit a row to get ready to do this on the wrong side. On the wrong side, I'm going to work the same 4 types of short rows, but in the reverse order. And so first I'm going to purl to my first turning point, purl 3. Now to work the shadow or twin method with my yarn in front, I first slip the next stitch. This is the stitch that would have been wrapped. I bring my needle, let me get the yarn out of the way. I bring my needle up underneath the stitch below. I pop it up on the needle and I just purl it. And so there I have the shadow. You can see the shadow is yellow, just like the stitch next to it. And then I have the original stitch, which is unworked. And I turn my work and I slip these 2 stitches back without working them right now and knit to the end. I turn my work, I purl 3 to my turning point, and there are my shadow or twin stitches. And you can see when you purl it, the yellow one actually comes to the back. Now I'm going to purl one more stitch The next method is my Sunday short row. So I'm going to turn my work. I'm going to pop the stitch marker on. I'm going to knit back across. I'm going to turn my work. I'm going to purl to my turning point. So this stitch is before the turning point, so I'm going to purl that. But to purl, remember all those slip purls? This gives you a lovely way to avoid that. With the yarn in front, slip the next stitch, pull up, and put this stitch up on your needle, and then move the slip stitch back, and now you can just purl two together. No slip purl. So now I'll purl one more stitch, and then I'm going to work my Japanese short row. So first I turn, slip one, pop the stitch marker on, and knit back across. Now I'm going to turn, I'm going to work back across. Now remember, this is not my gap because I slipped a stitch. Here's my gap, so I have to purl one more stitch. Now, most instructions for Japanese short rows will have you pull this up right now and then work a slip purl. But since we know a better way, let's go ahead and borrow that technique from Carol Sunday. Slip the stitch. Now I'm going to pull this and put it up on the needle. Then with the yarn in front, I will slip that stitch back and I will purl two together. There's still some slipping involved, but I think better than a slip purl. Now I'm going to purl one more stitch, and then I'm going to work my yarn over short row. With the yarn over short row, I'm going to turn, I'm going to yarn over, and I'm going to knit back across. I'm going to turn my work and purl back across. Now this is going to be tight, this last stitch, because here's the yarn over, here's the gap, the yarn over, and so we work this stitch. And now this stitch is on our needle. And so unfortunately, that means that we are going to need to go back to the slip purl. And then finish our row. Now I'm going to knit a row and purl a row first to make everything easier to see. So looking at what I've done and comparing these various lifted methods, I think if it weren't for the colorful yarn, we might be hard pressed to find the short rows. But we can see some striping, and so our yarn over is right here, our Japanese is right here, our Sunday is here, and our twin stitch, and we can see just a hint of the back of the twin that didn't quite disappear. Same thing, twin stitch, Sunday, Japanese, and yarn over. So any of these would make a beautiful substitute for your wrap and turn. It's a matter of personal preference. On the wrong side, we have a very similar story. We can see a few bars going across from our lifts, but basically there are no big bumps or no big gaps. So now to get ready for our final method, I'm going to knit the front, I'm going to knit the back, and then I'm going to knit purl. Now the last short row method I'm going to show you is really like nothing else, and it's known as a German short row. German short rows are a bit different when worked on the right side and worked on the wrong side, but they do have certain things in common. When the final stitch of a short row is worked to the turning point, then the work is turned. The working yarn needs to be in front, then the last stitch worked is slipped purlwise from left to right. The working yarn is pulled up and over the work to the back, creating a double stitch. the double stitch is always counted as a single stitch, and on a subsequent row, the double stitch is worked as a knit two together or purl two together, depending on the pattern. Because there is nothing that compares to the German short row, I'm going to work them on both sides at the same time, somewhat like you would do a sock heel. So on the first row, I'm actually going to knit 10. This is my turning point. So I turn my work, and then my yarn is in front already because this is now the wrong side and the back of what is a purl stitch. So I'm going to slip the first stitch purlwise from the left needle to the right, and you can actually at the same time pull up and over, creating a double stitch. So you see this loop on the top of your needle, and then I pulled that to the back, but my next stitch is going to be a purl, so I need to bring it forwards. And now I'm going to purl to my next turning point, which is going to be 7, because the double stitch took 1. And you'll now see I'm 2 stitches from the end. I'm going to turn my work. My yarn has to come forward, then I slip, then I pull, and this one is a little bit twisted, but that's okay. And you'll see the yarn is now in the back, which is great because I'm about to knit, and I'm going to knit 5. And that puts me with a stitch in between, 4 stitches from the end. And now I'm going to turn here. And again, the yarn's already in front. I slip the stitch. I pull up and over to create this double stitch. You don't want to pull it too hard. You really kind of want this little nub to be right up on top. I have to bring my yarn back forward because I'm going to purl. And I'm going to purl just a couple stitches. 1, 2, and I'll purl 3 so that there's 1 in between. And then again, that's my turning point. I want you to see it, but my yarn is in back. I'm turning my work. So the first thing, the yarn must come to the front because it's not already there. Slip the stitch, pull up, and then I'm going to knit. Now, I want to work all the way back across now. And so let's see what happens. First of all, that is an ugly looking stitch. There's no question about it. Biggest downside to German short rows is that they're miserably difficult to fix if you drop them. So you want to be incredibly careful. Because I am on the right side, I want to work this double stitch, and you can see it's part of the same stitch and it's looped up with the yellow stitch. I want to work that as a knit 2 together. So very carefully making sure that I have 2 blues on one side, 2 yellows on the other side, right through the middle of that double stitch. I work that as a knit 2 together. Let's see that again. Knit 1. Going into this stitch, again, very carefully making sure I have 2 legs in the front, 2 legs in the back. Work the double stitch. I'm going to work to the end of the row. I'm going to turn. Now that I've turned, I'm going to work back across. Now, it's hard to miss the double stitch, but it's a little less obvious on the purl row, so do be careful. You don't want to knit these legs separately. Here is my double stitch, which counts as 1 stitch. And again, as I mentioned, this one has a little twist because of the way it's worked, but it's still going to be beautiful. So very carefully insert to purl. Make sure that I have 2 legs in the front and 2 legs in the back before I work my purl 2 together. I'm going to work the stitch in between, which is sometimes a little tight right next to your double stitch. And here's my next double stitch. I'm going to carefully insert it into both legs and purl, and then finish the row. And then I am going to knit back across just to give us a little bit more to look at. Now, because I worked these in mirrored pairs, my fabric is getting a little bit of a pucker here, just like a sock heel would. But you can see from the color variations, you have 1 turning point right here, and you have another turning point right here, one here, but they are really very filled in, and also nicely on the back. There are no visible lumps or long stitches or anything, and nothing that's going to rub on your heel. As you have probably gathered, I am a big fan of German short rows, and I use them almost always when I need short rows, with a couple of exceptions. In garter stitch, they're not necessary, and they can actually create a little bit more of a bump than you may want, although I have used that as a decorative effect. There are also times when the designer may be using the bumps from a wrap and turn as part of the design, and so you wouldn't want to substitute them then. And finally, when they are worked too close together, sometimes they can't really pull the way they need to pull to create the double stitch, especially if there are multiple increases stacked up. If you want to substitute German short rows, the important thing is to remember that the turning point stays at the same place. So work to where the instruction says to wrap and turn, and then you just turn and you make the double stitch. Now you have to be careful when doing this, because sometimes instructions for subsequent rows are based off of the rows before rather than an absolute stitch count. So there are whole tutorials about this, but a good rule of thumb is your double stitches should be spaced exactly as your wrap and turns or any other lifting method. Your double stitches will just either be one stitch farther from your edges in the case of a short row heel, but potentially one stitch closer to the edge if you're stacking your rows up differently. I hope you have enjoyed this smorgasbord of various short row methods. Thanks again to KDO Studio for providing the platform. If you'd like to see more about me or my work, you can find me on social media. I hope to see you next year live at KDO, and in the meantime, wishing health to you and yours.